a supply chain, especially when one is trying to supply to a higher tier than them, one has to be very aware of how an OEM or a tier 1 supplier takes a decision on selecting the supplier. Actually, in any supply chain and at higher tiers, a group of people decide whether this supplier is fit enough to be used as a source or not. And this process is not transactional. That means it is not based on the submissions that you make. There is a check, counter check, and a lot of audits involved before one can become a supplier. From a buyer side, there is always going to be a unit, a decision-making unit, which is going to consist of more than one person, or from the buyer side, there is going to be a decision-making unit. This decision-making unit usually consists of one person from the purchase department, second person from the quality department, third person from the product development department, and also probably the fourth person from the production department. Now, this decision-making unit then decides whether the supplier is fit to supply or not. Due to the presence of 4 different departments in this decision-making process, one has to be aware and technically competent enough to answer the questions. However, due to the presence of 4 departments, the buying process itself gets complicated. The complexity is a derivative of the different measurements as used by 4 different departments. For example, the way a purchasing department gets evaluated is how cheap are they able to purchase. The quality department gets measured by how good have they been in controlling the incoming quality, and if there was a problem with the supplier, how good were they at improving the quality at the supplier's end. The R&D department actually may be working with the supplier much before any one of these departments actually got in touch, because the R&D department primarily is the source where the product gets developed, and if it gets developed, they need to have a vendor where they can go and test the process and develop a sample size to again bring it back to the company to test. So the product development department is actually using the process capabilities of the manufacturer to develop this component. Then comes the production person. Production person usually looks into the production capabilities and the capacities and the way the production operations are synchronized and organized at the supplier. Now, all these 4 departments have got different key result areas. So, if the production department is very much bent on making sure that the quantity arrives at the right time, the product development department initially looks at whether the process has got enough capability to make the product, and the product coming out after being tested is good enough. The quality departments make sure that the quality coming in is okay, and the purchase department's job is to make sure that they buy at the least price available. Now, depending on what is the task or what is the situation facing this DMU, you need to make your proposal. More than that, you also need to understand how are you going to interact with the team so that your points are nicely put across. It is quite likely that by satisfying just one of the 4 people in the DMU, that you will be able to get an order in. You may not become a preferred supplier if even one of them decides that you are not up to the mark. However, another aspect of this decision-making unit is also in play. Many times, there is an emergency because there is a current supplier who is faltering. Even if the current supplier is faltering and you have the capability of supplying, you are still put to the same levels of scrutiny. But then the chances of you getting on with the orders is going to be good. This just gives you the entry, and any future orders may still depend on how the decision-making unit then thinks about you in the future. So after having secured an entry, that means after having secured a qualification by the DMU, one still needs to make sure that you are constantly doing much above the threshold. That means you are doing much better than the order qualifying criteria of the DMU to sustain your future in a supply chain. The decision-making unit may not always be sitting together. Maybe a supplier has to go from one department to second to get the approvals. And maybe also the buyer may require not only you but your team to be present there for them to have a meaningful discussion. And probably this is the same decision-making unit which probably would come for an audit later on. So the relationship with the decision-making unit of a higher tier manufacturer is constantly in play. And this is what builds the trust in supply chain. We know that supply chains are basically put in place from the cost point of view as well as from the reliability point of view. That means cost and risk are the 2 main driving factors on which supply chains get built. So though the final cost in the supply chain has to be less, the risk also has to be minimum. So over a period of time, the DMU keeps working on making sure that the risk element is also low. If you decide to upgrade the technology, you need to consult with the product development people or the manufacturing people to get an approval whether this technology is worth investing in and your buyer is going to accept the product coming out of it. The product development people may have their own tests. Very often, processes are changed. For example, you can make a small gear from cutting a bar, cutting a steel bar to the size and start with machining operation, which is called making a blank. The same blank can also be produced by using a forging process. The final shape after the raw material is brought in different, the final shape might look similar, may perform same, but it is quite likely the internal grains of the gear can easily tell you whether this item has been made out of forging or using a bar stock. Now the decision making unit here comes into play again, and they would like you to very honestly come up and have a valid discussion with them that why was this process changed. If all the parameters remain same, the life of the product remains same, and they are convinced that there's not going to be a substantial difference in the performance of the gear, it may be accepted. Mind you, the gear design, if it is not even the proprietary of the customer that you're selling it to, but it's a proprietary of a much higher level purchaser, that means if the OEM has designed the gear, this approval will again have to be taken from the OEM. The OEM will allow your buyer to take a call only if the relationship of your buyer with the OEM has matured to such a level where the OEM now feels confident that your buyer has enough capability to develop or manage the technology that has been given to him. This is the role of the DMU. While the purchasing person, with whom probably one talks a lot, because he is the one who gives you the rate, and after the rate has been decided, the volume gets decided, he will only be hammering one point in, and that is, can you make it cheaper? Can you make it cheaper? And many times a cheaper option is due to a new process, and this new process again needs to be approved by another person. That means another part of the DMU. While the purchasing person is hammering on the cost, the production person is hammering on the delivery. He will make sure that he gets what he wants from you. And if there is a delay in delivery, he will not hesitate to put a negative comment on your performance. The reason why I bring this decision-making unit aspect into this supply chain part, it not only is a threat to you, but it's also a place where the reason why I bring the decision-making unit discussion into my supply chain concepts is there may be a threat to you because there's more than one person with whom you are supposed to interact or convince, but in other way, this is also your surety. One of the four may always be contesting your ways of working and trying to improve you, but also understand that it becomes much tougher for the company which has got a DMU to move from one supplier to second supplier also. You as a supplier could be very good on 3 of the 4 parameters. So it is not very easy for the purchasing person who says this fellow does not supply me at the price I want to go to another supplier, because now there is a big entry barrier. So while decision making unit make it tough for you to get anything done smoothly, it also is one unit which also increases the entry barrier. So it's not very easy for your competition to enter at free will or just come in because they're supplying cheaper. By using the decision making unit concept, most of the supply chains make sure that the quality, delivery and the cost aspects of a supplier are very nicely looked after by technically competent people. It is here also sometimes when you develop a new technology or you develop a new product, the product development department of the DMU is able to understand your true contributions and then probably give you a bias. That means give you more points and then you win. The purchasing person is not concerned with what technology you're using. So if you're constantly talking to the purchasing person, it is quite likely that price is going to be the only point to discuss. But as we said earlier, supply chains are not designed only for the cost reduction part of it. And when we say cost reduction, I'm not talking about per unit cost reduction. I'm talking about the cost reduction in entirety from beginning to end. So they're not only designed for cost part, they're also designed for making sure that we make better products. We use better technology to increase the longevity of our products, to make it more customer friendly, to make it more production friendly, to reduce obsolescence. So many other aspects come into play that decide whether the supplier is really worth keeping in the supply chain or not. So DMUs actually impact the decision-making part of any one of you trying to enter a bigger supply chain.